Добрый вечер. Дорогие друзья, мы начинаем нашу одну из последних лекций этого лета в рамках летней программы Института Стрелка. И сегодня нам прочтет лекцию Беатрис Коломина, историк архитектуры, профессор Принстонского университета, о радикальной педагогике в архитектуре. Пожалуйста.
Thank you very much. I'm really happy to be here with you in this beautiful evening and in this really beautiful space, talking about radical pedagogies in a place that is one of the few that today is really experimenting with new forms of pedagogy in architecture. The project of Radical Pedagogies is a research project that I have been carrying out for a number of years at Princeton University. So it's a collaborative project with PhD students involving, of course, deep archival research, lectures, workshops, etc., with protagonists of the period. So we go back to this moment of the 60s and 70s to basically look at the last time that there was real experimentation in the field of architectural education. Do you hear me well? Yeah? Okay, good. That's a good beginning. Okay, so the organizing paradigm of my own work is collaborative work, right? In which the distinctions between teacher and student are a little bit blurred. So the idea is that today we live in a much more horizontal society, and the idea of a top-down education is completely bankrupt. So what I do is to work with the students collaboratively on the research, and preferably on a topic of which I don't know much, the same than them at the beginning. So we enter somehow the project together, and we do the research in a collaborative way. The project is, and here you have a map of the world where you can see the different experiments that took place in the post-war years, and as you can see, it's not just a phenomenon of Europe and the United States, but it's in a way a global phenomenon too of these experiments in pedagogy, involving many things in Latin America, even India. Also, more and more we discover things in Australia, New Zealand, and in Asia, of course, in Tokyo and other parts of the world. In fact, a very important part of the project is the idea of activism. The majority of these protagonists of this period are not only teachers, but are also activists. Think, for example, here about Giancarlo De Carlo in the Triennale de Milano of 1968. The students are trying to close the Triennale, and if you look at the picture, perhaps you think, oh, Giancarlo De Carlo, which is, of course, can we use this, maybe? Yeah. Is this guy with the tie and the jacket is really the conservative guy, and the students are the radical group. But in fact, it's more complicated than this, because Giancarlo De Carlo was an anarchist, and in fact, the situation in which the students are kind of trying to close the Triennale that he is organized, he's very much interested in this dialogue. So he himself had been also an activist. This is the Biennale now, the Triennale di Milano Occupata, and other groups like Global Tools or even Ant Farm or even Manfredo Tafuri are other examples from this period in which the teacher is also kind of an activist, right? Tafuri famously was a communist, and a lot of his teaching is in fact very much influenced by his position. We ourselves as a team also consider ourselves activists, so our research we hope has an impact in the world. Our study of the forms of pedagogy will have an effect in forms of pedagogy in the architectural world. The project is part of a series of experiments that I have been carrying for a number of years in the PhD program at Princeton. The initial idea was to try to find a new educational model in which, instead of having PhD students working in isolation in some kind of obscure research that is only interest to them and perhaps to their advisor, you take PhD students in their first year and you work with them collaboratively in the research, also the students from different years. But also very important, this research is oriented towards the production of something, a book, a conference, an exhibition, a film, etc. It is now about 40 years since the first PhD programs were first established in the United States. Let me give you some numbers. Berkeley was 1970, 73 was Princeton, 74 MIT, Harvard didn't have a PhD program until 87, Columbia University did not have a PhD program until 1994, Yale didn't have a PhD program until 2009. So in many ways you can say that some of these programs are still in their infancy. Our idea was to try to bring the collaborative applied thinking of design studios to use this as a model for scholarly research. Perhaps this is, of course, a delay lesson from learning from Las Vegas, which also use a studio contest to develop a theory and publish in the form of this innovative book. We do the reverse. We treat scholarly work as a kind of a studio project, working collaboratively as a kind of think tank, and the research itself, we consider it also an act of design. So very briefly, to give you a sense, since 2000, I have led about 7 experiments in this spirit, which include Cold War hot houses, which ended up in this book that you can see. All these different names are different PhD students that contribute to the research. This is part of the research. Very quickly, after this, I did this conference discipline building, which is about the history of PhD programs in architecture, and involve all protagonists of these programs, people that were the directors of these programs, like Stanford Anderson or Tony Bidler, but also people like Peter Eisman or Denise Scott Brown, Diana Agres, etc. And then the second generation of Michael Hayes, Jarson Beck, etc., reflecting on the history of the history of history and theory, actually, in architecture schools in the United States. The next one actually was a study of little magazines. It's called Clip Stand 4, and became an exhibition. And it's a study of radical magazines of the 60s and 70s. And the exhibition opened, as you can see here, in the gallery of a storefront in New York. This is a very kind of narrow triangle where you can see our exhibition with the wallpaper of covers, the timeline of the exhibition, and in the bubbles we have actually the originals. And again, the wallpaper and more images of a storefront for art and architecture. And as I say, we not only did the entire research of these magazines, but we designed the exhibition and even installed it. There was no money whatsoever. Storefront is very poor. And I thought that this was also a very interesting part of the pedagogical program. You have PhD students that are normally very pale and in the library, and they kind of isolated from the wall, and you put them in that situation in which you have to use kind of electric drillers and hammers, and I thought this was really a good therapy for writer's blocks and all these other disorders that are typical of scholars and PhD students. So you have here the students mounting the exhibition. Because it was New York, it was possible during the time the exhibition was there to bring all the original protagonists. So for example, this night we have the entire group of oppositions coming and talking about the beginning of oppositions. And you can see it's a packed house, everybody is standing, so we can listen to them. This is the night in which we did October magazine with Rosalind Krauss, Yves Lambois, and Hal Foster, and again it's another entire house. Another night we did the London Underground with all these people from Archigram. And another night we did the magazines of New York, little magazines of New York, such as Skyline or Pamphlet Architecture that Stephen Hall used to do, or Skyline, and we brought all the editors there. They were also impromptu seminars, because New York is a bit like a central station. If you stay quiet for a while, everybody will come around at a certain point. So at a certain point, Hans Hollein appeared, and we had also a session with him. And here is Hans Hollein, and this is Rem Koolhaas that also arrived actually the day that the exhibition was supposed to open, and you can see it's not finished. There are things in the middle. But he had to do something at the GSD that evening and could not stay for the opening, but wanted to see it. And it was really funny because he comes into the gallery and he says, I have 5 minutes. And I say, well, you know, he always says he has 5 minutes. I say, that's good, because, you know, we have to finish this bloody exhibition before the opening. But then an hour passes and he is still there discussing the magazines. Also, he brought with him Nikolai Urosev, who then wrote a very big article in the New York Times, and the exhibition was covering more than 50 magazines worldwide. So the result is that the exhibition then was asked for in many locations, including the CCA in Montreal, which is a museum, of course, so it's a lot more clean than at the storefront, and the project is completely different. Again, every time the same thing. They send us the plans of the space, and with the PhD students we work on the project. And also very important, we also go for the opening, and I went with a few students, and it's also another pedagogical moment, because of course then we presented the project to the public in Montreal. From there we went to Documenta in Kassel. Again, I have forgotten to mention that a very significant part of the exhibition is this newsletter that includes fragments of the interviews we have done with people all over the world. I don't know whether you saw in the exhibition there are these, and also in storefront, there are these speakers, that directional speakers, where you can hear fragments of the interviews that we did with all the protagonists all over the world. You see that it looks very different in different places. And this is part of the deal too. When we were in Germany, we did a lot of research on German magazines and added to the research. So other people from Germany also contributed to the exhibition. The same thing in Montreal. So the idea is that it's not an exhibition that travels from place to place, but an exhibition that as it goes to a place, engages with that place, finds magazines that we never knew about them, incorporates them. So it's kind of an interactive phenomena in which we have other people that collaborate, and that they end up doing dissertations on some of these materials. So it's very much an open source thing too, in which we provide all this material, and other people do this with us too. So we went to the AA in London here with Brett Steele and Sumon Basar, and here are some of my students, Urti Grau, talking about the exhibition during the inauguration, and other people that we invited. You can see there Stanley von Moss, Hal Foster, etc. Since it's London, it was very easy to bring together all these people that are kind of the surviving members of Archigram, for example, Peter Cook, and also Dennis Sharp, who no longer lives, so Stanley von Moss, all the people that were protagonists and editors of magazines like Claude Parent here, or Madelon Brissendorp, or here is Claude Parent, Rafael Moneo, etc. So the important thing is that then these events are always filmed, and they become part of the next exhibition. For example, now here we are in Barcelona, where of course it was easy to bring people like Oriol Boigas and Rafael Moneo, but then also other people like Hans Hollein, Chip Lord, Peter Cook, etc. came for the event. This is the exhibition in Barcelona, where again I'm from Barcelona, so I thought I knew everything about architectural magazines in Barcelona, but even there I discovered things that I didn't know, or that even the protagonists didn't know. For example, Boigas have done this magazine called La Mosca. Mosca means fly, and there was only one issue, and it became part of the exhibition. You can see here in Barcelona what is already happening. That the events that happen in New York are now being seen in Barcelona, and the events that will happen in Barcelona will then be seen in another city. So it becomes again part of this archive that grows as it goes from city to city, and that reacts to the people that see it and incorporates its reactions. Here we are in Oslo, where they have this very valuable wall that we couldn't touch, so we couldn't use wallpaper, so we used this kind of shower curtain, and then the people in Oslo wanted to have a shower curtain, or somebody wanted to make a skirt with it, but it's all to talk about somehow the ways in which different things, different or inventions have to be developed for the situation. Everybody, as it's happening now with the radical pedagogies, keep asking, where is the book? When are you going to come up with the book? We haven't thought about the book. I thought it will be a platform. I thought that we will do it online, but everybody had a desire for the book, so in the end we have to do this very fat book that incorporated all these interviews with people from all over the world. But in fact, it's an impossible project, because as soon as we finish this door stopper, of course we were already going to Chile or to Bogota, where we discovered magazines that are not in the libraries in Columbia University or in Princeton. And now we are coming up with another second edition that incorporates these magazines. So in fact, it's an impossible project. We have the same dilemma now with the radical pedagogies, because everybody says, where is the book? And I don't know about that. Here is in the magazine in Bogota, where again 450 people turn up in the opening. They never had anything like that in this gallery. And then again, we had a lot of people from there that did the research, or protagonists of these magazines in Latin America that contribute to the discussion. And then in Chile, also the exhibition, very quickly in a library, which was also an interesting thing, because those are magazines after all. And here you have a very different, again, project. And again, several of my students, like Urthi and Craig, who are now all, of course, faculty members in different places. Craig is now a professor at Yale. And Urthi is a very good architect, winner of several competitions and of the 40 under 40, etc. So this is also interesting, because we used to be that we think of PhD programs as programs of people that only want to be professor of history and theory. This is no longer the case. Very talented architects come to PhD programs. And also it's interesting that people that are not from architecture also come to PhD programs. So Craig is not from architecture, he's from art history, but people come from all kinds of backgrounds, and also creates this kind of interdisciplinary effect that is really very important. And this is a guy from Chile that collaborated with us in the research of magazines in Chile. And this is the band. After Clip Stand 4, we did this project which is called Learning from Levittown. It's a studio that Denise Scott Brown and Robert Venturi did after the famous studio Learning from Las Vegas. In fact, it has the same, absolutely the same structure, but it was so controversial. You see that initially it was called Remedial Housing for Architects, but then in handwriting of Denise, you can see all Learning from Levittown. And it was so controversial, much more controversial even than Las Vegas, that the book was never completed. We went to see Denise and Bob in their offices. They were very generous. We had seminars with them in their office. We went down to the archives. We saw all the material there. We did a lot of research. There were even the boards that had been used during the review at Yale. It's a very interesting story that Bob Venturi told me. That Vincent Scully walked in for the review and realized that they had been working on Levittown and left, right? So they were so offended by the idea that people will work on something so tacky as Levittown that they left the building. But in fact, it was a very innovative pedagogical project in which they are not only looking at the houses, but they are also looking at the attitudes of Americans towards housing, and attitudes that change according to the socioeconomical group and even racial groups, and also look at soap operas and the way the house was represented in the media. So this is really incredibly innovative for 1970. Even cartoons like this one of Daisy Duck, who lives in a kind of Levittown house, but she dreams of changing her place and has neighbors even that want to consult with her. But really the breaking point in this project happened when, unfortunately for Denise, she broke her back. She was going up a ladder to pick up some books and she fell. And she was very bored. And we have been meeting always in the office and the archives, and she said, why don't you come and see and talk to me in my house? And I said, well, that's nice, you know, because Bob have always told me, Bob Venturi, that their house was the only Art Nouveau house in the United States, so I was very curious about that. And then I thought to myself, well, you know, maybe I could bring my students. So I called back and said, can I bring my students? And she said, yeah, bring your students. Then after a while I thought, well, you know, she just broke her back, and the previous year Bob has broken his wrist, and these guys are getting old. So I thought to myself, how long this is going to be possible? So I called back and I said, can I bring a filmmaker? And she says, oh yeah, I love filmmakers. My son is a filmmaker. It's a pity that he's in Europe right now, but bring a filmmaker. So I went and found a young filmmaker from NYU, and I went with the filmmaker, and it's really amazing, because you not only have an Art Nouveau house, but you come inside and it's full of all this crazy stuff, like these signs from McDonald's, together with Rosenberg and Andy Warhol paintings, this kind of unbelievable collection of things. And here we are with the filmmaker trying to record this incredible moment in which these two people, you can see she's wearing, Denise is wearing this brace that she say it would have made Bucky Fuller proud, and they are like an open book. You put the camera in front of them and they immediately start talking as if you don't have to edit anything, it's perfect. And so the idea with this project then will be at first it thought to be an edition of a book never published, the book of Lenin from Levittown, which was supposed to be the companion volume of Lenin from Las Vegas, but it never came out. But now I'm thinking it should just be both, a book but also a documentary of this moment, which then talking about this, this studio in the 1970s and why everybody at Yale was so aggressive against them. This is the exhibition Playboy Architecture, which is another one of these projects. Each project lasts more or less for about 2 years. It's very difficult to do things in less than 2 years. It's 2 to 3 years. And it involves people from different years. So some people have been working on Clip Stand Fall, and then they work on Playboy or on Levittown, right? So it's not just they only work on one project. They work on whatever they want. And some of them join this project. The idea of Playboy is very simple. Again, all these ideas are very simple, but in fact, they are kind of obvious, but nobody has looked at them. For example, Playboy has been studied by many people. Umberto Eco wrote a book about Playboy, literature in Playboy. It's very important for all the fields. We never realized how significant it was to the field of architecture. From the 1950s on, with all the shelter magazines were recommending people to do really crazy, tacky decorations to their houses with frilly things, and they were very much opposed to modern architecture. In fact, magazines like House and Garden wrote articles attacking Mies van der Rohe as the threat to the new America. So all these leftist architects that were coming from Europe were destroying America as we knew it. Playboy, instead, from 1952, from the first year, is completely in favor of modern architecture. They have big articles on Franjo Wright, on Mies van der Rohe. Then they move through all the 1950s generation of the Eames, Noyes, Saarinen, etc. And then we end up with the magazine starts to cover the most radical architecture of the 1960s and 70s, including Ant Farm, Solari, Lothner, etc. So they were really on. And this is the exhibition at Maastricht in the Netherlands. And very important aspect is the question of the Cold War. Of course, the magazine of Playboy is a Cold War product. Design actually used heavily during the war in Vietnam, but also during the World War II. It was lining all these Kunstwerk all over the world, and it was also very important in films. And here you have this plane, the Playboy plane, which also was part of the exhibition, and the closet with all the things that the Playboy needs to have are collected. And finally, the chairs, which, as you can see in the exhibition there, those are all from the magazine. You can see how the chairs are very much kind of a portable architecture for the playmate of Playboy magazine. From Maastricht, the exhibition went to the Dam in Frankfurt and to other places like the NIE in Rotterdam. The last project that I have done is about Latin American architecture, the historiography of Latin American architecture, and here we are in Sao Paulo presenting a kind of pilot study with some of our students doing the presentation. And this is actually Masha Pantaleyeva, who is from Russia and is a PhD student at Princeton and is talking to the group in Sao Paulo about the exhibition. Well, with this we arrive really at radical pedagogies, which is the project that opened in Lisbon, architecture education in a time of disciplinary instability. They gave us this beautiful old ruin of a school, and we installed the exhibition here. Instead of this traditional map, we had a kind of Bucky Fuller map, and this is the idea of the project, as you can see, realized in very simple ways in this exhibition of Lisbon a year ago now. The exhibition included also recordings where you can listen, for example, to Tafuri speaking or other documents of that order. Syllabus, all the aspects of that we call books, even originals. And we have, they are hanging on the wall, and you could make your own booklet, all the different exercise, syllabus, etc., of different programs. We were also there in Lisbon, and we were asked to make this event in the middle of a private square, a public square in Lisbon. And there we are presenting the project to a big public and interacting with other people about radical pedagogies. There were a number of magazines like the Architectural Review and even little magazines like Pigeon of Princeton that asked us for contributions, so there had been a little bit of writing also on this project already. This winter, the Biennale of Venice asked us to present the exhibition in the Venice Biennale of this year. In the Arsenale, this is the situation. At first, we were given, like everybody else, a slide around one of these columns. And finally, we were told to use this big wall there, which is what we did. We have to do a lot of research because this was in Mont Italia. So most of the cases center around Italy, which was, of course, very significant during this moment, but also the movements of Italians in and outside the country. So, of course, Italian was very much a protagonist during this moment in terms of all the experiments in pedagogy. But what people didn't seem to realize is that Italy was not Italy anymore, that people from Italy were teaching in Barcelona, in the United States. So the world, as we knew, has already changed. Here we are preparing the exhibition. And these are some images where you can see also that people are using the archive as a resource. People were copying things, were taking all these tests from here and using their iPads to see the augmented reality, to get more information about any one of those cases that were organized geographically by latitude. So this is what refers the map, the big map on the wall refers to this organization. Here is the moment in which we were giving a mention. I was talking with Brendan before about how the best projects got mentions instead of lions. This is typical. And I made the point, which was difficult for the Biennale to accept at first, that everybody involved in the team should come to the platform. The Biennale is a very hierarchical structure. They were actually very shocked that I wanted to bring all these kids up in the podium. But as you can see, I just kind of did it anyway. And it had an incredible effect, because at first they were shocked. There were all these people, you see how they are trying to move so that they can fit, and you can see the face of amusement of Rem and of some of them. But then the good effect was that the subsequent groups also brought the entire team up, and this is actually the first time that this happened in the Biennale, because normally one person comes to get an award, not a team. And I think we're in a time in which we can no longer sustain this idea of the only individual and the only creator. In fact, this is a very suspect idea that we keep holding on to in architecture. Architecture is a very complex, collaborative world in which many, many people are involved, and it's about time that we actually give credit to all of this. Again, those are some of the case studies. The key point of the Radical Pedagogy project is that pedagogical experiments play a crucial role in shaping architectural discourse and practice in the second half of the 20th century. The organizing hypothesis then of our research project is that these experiments can be understood as radical architectural practices in their own right. They are radical in the literal meaning of the word root, radice. It comes from the Latin radix, which is something belonging to the roots, to the basis and the foundations. So radical pedagogies question the basis of architectural, they shake foundations, they disturb assumptions rather than reinforcing and disseminating them. This challenge to normative thinking, as you can see, was a major force in the post-war field of architecture and has surprisingly been neglected. And here you have some of these case studies like Valparaiso, the Polyart bus in London, organized by Cedric Price and Peter Murray, that didn't believe in education taking place in only one place, so they will take the bus around the country, or the IMSS in India, or Negroponte in the machine group at MIT before even the Media Lab. This is a predecessor of the Media Lab, etc. This is all happening in a time of collective, if you want, defiance against the authority of institutional, bureaucratic, and capitalistic structures. a geopolitical landscape further transformed by the Cold War and the Vietnam War. So you can see it's not just, it's May 68, of course, but it's not just May 68, but every dimension of society that is being questioned. Here is May 68, of course, but also, again, May 68, represented in many magazines, but also squatters in London, or the Triennale Occupata, as you can see before, again, more Triennale, Columbia University on strike, Yale University on strike. You can see the banner on the building, Free the Panthers, because the Panthers trial was happening at that time, and the students are in the street protesting the trial of the Panthers, and freeing the Panthers is their call, right? But they are not just, as I say, in Europe versus the United States. There are also protests in Valparaiso in 1967, that is before 68, and there are protests also in Mexico, where, as you know, many students were killed. This is all, of course, in the context of the Cold War. And here you have, of course, Nikita Khrushchev with Nixon in the famous kitchen debates here in Moscow of 1959, and the famous debates as represented in Life magazine. Further, we can talk about the Vietnam War and the space race, and of course, an environment built out of consumable plastics and objects of mass produced desire. Utopian technological prophecies foretold in science fiction now were realized in a brave new world of computation, gadgets, and spaceships. And the important thing to realize is that architecture was not at all impervious to such shifts. So, whether in high-tech spaceships, like in these ones that you can see here, or Villa Rosa of Kopfhimmelblau, or in terms of informless, and we now think that the preoccupation with favelas is from the other day, but you can see, going back to the magazines of the 70s, that this is very much a preoccupation of that time. Architecture itself has become indeterminate. What is architecture becomes a question in this time. In this situation, the discipline was kind of forced to examine its own protocols, and while some forms of radical practice celebrated architecture's integration into a larger cultural milieu, whether it's political, as we have seen a minute ago, cultural, economical, or even ecological. Remember that this is the time also of the first preoccupations with ecology. This is actually a magazine, Domus, in 1970, Earth, Help, right? So instead, at the same time, it may seem paradoxical to you, but there are also forms of radical practice. You can see this retreat at the same time, which we also consider radical, into formalismo. This is another form of radicality, going back to the roots of what is architecture. This fiction that this is what one needed to do in pedagogy, go back to the beginning, as exemplified, for example, in the work being done at Cooper Union. So they seem very different, but they have this very much thing in common. Education, in any case, became a vehicle for these subversive actions. Alternative visions of the discipline were generated through progressive pedagogical initiatives. And this, as I say, is a phenomenon that happens not just in the United States, but also, as you can see here, in Mexico. And here is Mexico, but also you can see the AA in London. I was talking a little bit before with Anya in an interview, and we were talking about this moment, and I wanted to point to this, because when I first looked at the AA, I thought the students must have been in awe, given that the Archigram people were teaching there, that the Smithsons were teaching there, but in fact the opposite is the case. From the very beginning, the students were producing these little magazines that you can see are very irreverent to their professors. So this is a magazine called architectural radical students and educators. Ars is the name, which of course means also us. So it's, and they're making fun of Peter Cook, for example. This, of course, the AA in those years, which was a very radical school indeed, with an elephant, Alvin Boyarsky on top of an elephant. And let me also give you the kind of the feeling of this period. This quotation from Ren Koolhaas, who was also a student at the A at the time. This is 1972. The scene, he writes, London's Architectural Association, 1970-1972. A school abass in sex, drugs, and rock and roll. David Bowie hanging at the bar. For a studio, write a book if you want. Dance or piss your pants if you want. Structures or codes or HVAC, go to Switzerland, right? So this actually, in many ways, captures the situation of the AA and of many other schools at that time. You want to know anything about how a building is put together, go to Switzerland. That's not what you are going to learn here. In fact, I think that for what I have heard from people, despite this quotation, Rem seemed to have been a bit disappointed because he came from journalism, of course, and he was expecting to learn something about how you put a building together when he arrived at the AA and found out that he couldn't learn anything at all, that everybody was doing actually films or whatever. The term radical pedagogy, to say a couple of words about it, is of course a play on radical architecture or radical design, as you can see here, which is a term that was coined by Germano Celant from this period to talk about diverse production of different groups, so Italian groups, individuals, and publication, ranging in time from 63 to 71 and including Superstudio, Archivum, UFO, 999, etc. So all we are saying, adopting this term radical, is that there is a kind of parallel revolution, subversion, if you want, taking place in architecture and not just limited to Italy, but as I have said repeatedly, worldwide. But is radical pedagogy an oxymoron? This is one of the first questions that the group to emerge in our group. And in fact, if radical means going back to the roots, to the origins, to change the system, and pedagogy implies a system, then radical pedagogy seems like an oxymoron. But perhaps this is true of all radical practices. You need a system to undermine another existing system. A radical pedagogy, in other words, might be a sort of transitional phase. Not radical pedagogy can last for a long time in the same way that not radical avant-garde practice can last for a long time. That is, a system is developed to undermine an existing system, but eventually, or sooner or later, the new system is institutionalized and no longer radical. This, of course, can be easily understood when you think about the Cooper Union today or about other schools. No longer radical. And it will have to be undermined by another form of radical practice. In the very same way that every avant-garde inevitably becomes a monument that needs to be challenged by another one. It is important to remember in that sense that avant-garde practices are always systematic, even before they are absorbed by the institutions of the market. From formal meetings like those you can see here in Ulm, or conferences, there is Banham with Maldonado and Bucky Fuller also in Ulm, or this conference that you can see at, in Princeton, Diana Agres, Peter Eisman on the table, Mario Gandelson as Manfredo Tafuri and Tony Bidler, Mario, Peter, Diana, and this is Machado. But also these formal dinners, as you can see here in the Institute for Architecture and Urban Studies, again, Peter Eisman, Mario Gandelson, Rem Koolhaas, Madelon, Tony Bidler, Kenneth Frampton, Diana Grace. And it's also funny how you look back and then half of the people in the table, you have no idea who they are. So they must have been important at that point and then they are not anymore or something like this. So that also happens, right? So to these formal dinners, to meetings like this one, Greek parties in the grass, or meetings in the grass with Bucky Fuller at Carbondale, or on the beach, in which the students and the professor make their own kind of architecture. Subversion takes on a very architectural quality. A very important reference in my teaching has been Jacques Rancière, who wrote this famous book, The Ignorant Schoolmaster. This is a book that narrates the intellectual adventures of a fictional figure, Joseph Jacotot, which discovers the possibility of teaching things that he doesn't know, and simultaneously triggers a process of emancipation. So in Rancière, what he does is presents the typical act of mastery, of teaching, of explication. He describes it as a form of stultification, which assumes that one intelligence is superior to another. And opposing to these relations of subordination, he proposes this idea that you can teach things that you don't know. I think this is very much part of the experiment in which I have been involved by deliberately choosing topics of which initially I have no idea, right? And jumping into the research with them so I can teach things I really don't know. I learn in the process. From the multiple case studies that were presented at Venice, you can go to the website of Radical Pedagogies and read all the different cases, but include things like Black Mountain College, very famous, includes many important figures like the Albers, Joseph Fanny Albers, Case, Bucky Fuller, etc. Here you have actually Bucky Fuller with Merce Cunningham. And here you have Merce Cunningham and Bucky Fuller, and they are doing the domes, and Bucky Fuller in Carbondale, and Bucky Fuller in Princeton, and Bucky Fuller everywhere, because Bucky Fuller, again, didn't think that one should teach in a place. He thought of himself as a teacher of thousands and thousands of students worldwide from all the different schools that he visited. Instead, you have the opposite example, which is the super institutionalization of something like Ulm, going off the grid with this building that becomes itself a form of pedagogy. The whole thing about Ulm is the building, of course, is by Max Bill. And the idea was that the students were living there and that there is no distinction between the design of industrial objects and the design of architecture. And of course, many, many people participated. Like here you have the IMSS with Max Bill. The Texas Rangers, also very important. This is where the group of Haydock and Slasky came up, and Cooper Union came up from this. Colin Rowe is also very much part of that group that was very effective. I'm going really fast to finish. This is Cooper Union, which was also a very important study. Valparaiso, which also is very interdisciplinary in Chile, and which involves people like Alberto Cruz, which is an architect, but also a poet. And they have all this idea about creating poetic acts, like this Faliene, that they will do on the beach, and they will go out of the, in the streets and into the beach to perform these things. And again, Mexico, or Sao Paulo, again the building of Artigas, which is really important. I'm going really fast so that you can go online and look at them, because I don't have time to, if we have to have a discussion, to go through all of these. This is very interesting. It's La Escuelita in Argentina. I didn't know anything about it. Some people in Latin America pointed out to me that the most interesting professors of the School of Argentina were thrown out by the dictatorship out of the university, and they mounted this alternative school. And you can see they invited people like Rossi to come and teach there. Other cases include, I already talked about Las Vegas, and Lenin from Levittown. This is the Institute for Architecture and Urban Studies. Was typical of Peter. They put all the faculty as if it was a football team. There they are instead of the reviews, very formal. This is the Universitas projects at MoMA. which is really important, in which it brings people like Hannah Arendt and Baudrillard and Umberto Eco and so many other great thinkers of that time to discuss what design is. So this is a time in which the Museum of Modern Art is also involved in what does it mean to teach design in our time. People like Lefebvre, where they are extraordinary people, were part of this event. And this is Dalibor Vesely and Ricbert at Essex. Again, the idea that to teach architecture, you should teach culture, and it's the first program that provides a degree in which the idea is not that you teach how to do a building, but what is the historical and cultural context in which this is happening. Same thing for Tafuri, who for the first time you could get a master in Venice and never have touched a pencil. So you didn't need to draw a building. All that Tafuri did was to put together a team of people working in literature, in film, in art, etc. And you have this very interdisciplinary group. Again, Global Tours, another nomadic school in Florence, that went around from place to place, and you can see these very strange instruments because they believe also in going back to some very primitive forms of education. Or Giancarlo De Carlo in Urbino, again an itinerant school that sometimes was in Urbino, sometimes in other places. The Polyarch that we already talked about is also an itinerant school. Negroponte and the Machine Group brought computers into architecture. But also we discovered during the process of this, everybody talks about the MIT lab, but nobody seemed to remember that at the GSD, even before MIT, there was a very significant media lab, and that computers were a very important part of the curriculum. The IMSS in India, Kenzo Tange in Tokyo, also to make the point that those are all global schools, very fast, Fry Auto, and then very interesting too, this whole thing about equal access, which is also very contemporary. At Berkeley, which at that time was considered, in positive terms, they used the word creep, the creep capital of Europe, because of the huge amount of people with handicaps that were living on campus independently. And the students decided to be part of this group that will design an accessible campus and think about accessibility in architecture. So again, this is very early in the 70s, and you have this incredible effect. So these are some of the students, and there are different projects. The project index has grown enormously, so not everybody is here. So why are we doing this? Perhaps this is important. Architectural pedagogy, in my view, has become stale. Schools are spinning, for the most part, all wheels as if something is happening, but very little is actually going on. I think the majority of the schools that were very innovative in the 70s are now normal. Faculty tends to worry too much about their place in the institutional hierarchies, whether they get tenure or not get tenure, more than about what they are teaching. Curricular structures have hardly changed in recent decades, despite major transformations that have taken place with the growth of globalization, new technologies, and information culture. As schools appear to increasingly, at least in the United States, favor professionalization, they seem to be drowned in self-imposed bureaucracies, suffocating any possibility for the emergence of experimental practice and failures. There are a few attempts here and there, but in fact they are all too timid in the end. I mean, I may have to exclude, of course, the Strelka and other things happening over here, but this is, I think, true if you compare the phenomenon of the 70s to what is happening now globally. That is really boring. So in response to the timidity of the schools today, the Radical Pedagogy project returns us to the educational experiments of the 60s and 70s to remind us of what can happen when pedagogy takes on risks. So in that sense, it's a kind of a provocation and also a call to arms. Thank you very much.
Спасибо большое, что пришли. Через 5 минут мы начнем дискуссию. Пожалуйста, оставайтесь, кто заходит.
Я быстро представлю ее участников, потом представлюсь сама. С нами Beatriz Colomina, которая только что прочитала чудесную лекцию, Nikita Tokarev, директор школы Марш, и Brendan McGetrick, это преподаватель института Стрелка и один из кураторов русского павильона Венецианской биеннале. Меня зовут Аня, я выпускница Стрелки и сейчас работаю в институте. Thank you for your lecture, Beatriz. It was really inspiring, and I was thinking that the theme of the discussion we have today, new architectural education, is a big field for manipulation because we can discuss big ideas, we can talk about big trends that shape architectural education, but it's always interesting what is happening in different schools around the world because, of course, it's different. We cannot generalize the picture. I was wondering, looking at the last 30 years of architectural education, is there something you think as a breakthrough, something radically new, and something that influences the profession and the education now a lot?
You are asking me that question because I think I just say that this is, in my view, I mean, precisely actually out of, in a way, disappointment with the way the schools were going. I mean, the way the schools in the United States at that point, when I started the project, thought of themselves, not just in the United States, but also in other parts of the world, as radical when they were no longer so. When perhaps the innovations that were put in place by Alvin Boyarsky were a radical transformation of what architectural education was supposed to be at all levels. Imagine that at the AA at that point, all the students, before Alvin Boyarsky arrived, were British. Can you imagine? A school that was all British. And then Alvin Boyarsky comes and he changes the curriculum to such an extent that Margaret Thatcher, that was then the Minister of Education, took away the grants that British students used to get to be studying in the AA, with the result that the next year, nobody from Britain is at the AA, and Alvin Boyarsky has to go all over the world to places like Malaysia, India, Latin America, Russia. I mean, there are students from Russia. I don't know how they got there, but I've seen a list of students and where do they come from in the archives of the AA. They actually, and I counted 65 countries. And there are tons of students from every corner of the world. So it's the first that you can see really global school of architecture, and also in terms, not only in terms of the students, but also in terms of the faculty, and also that came from all over, from Japan, from wherever you from Latin America, again from everywhere, from the United States. So this was a radical transformation, but Boyarsky, for example, believed, and at that point that was radical, but now it's like, okay, it's normal, acceptable, that the idea that you should teach the profession of architecture in a school of architecture was ridiculous. That this is something that you could learn in an office easily, much easily, and that the obligation of the school was to immerse the student in what he calls a conversation, into a global conversation, and to bring this conversation, he brings Arata Isozaki from Tokyo, which of course is a young Turk, or Super Studio from Italy, or who knows, who from all over the place. It's also the first time, it's all very related to the 747 and to communication, that finally was cheap to fly, right? I mean, it was actually cheaper than it is now, and much less of a hassle. It was faster to go from New York to London than it is today, right? Because there was not all these crazy things with the security. You could arrive, and I have arrived still in the 80s to JFK with a flight departing for Europe in 10 minutes and run. I remember that perfectly well in the TWA. Nobody cared about whether you had your passport in the past. That was the problem of the other side, right? So because of that and the lack of problems, the planes were not that full, and they flew at much higher speed. You could go from London to New York in 5 hours. Everybody will tell you that. Bernard Tschumi, Rem Koolhaas, etc., were the first generation of actually commuter teachers, commuter across the Atlantic. So they were coming from all over. Now, the thing is that now the unit system and this kind of menu, Chinese menu of classes that you can choose from a vegetable and a meat or whatever, you know, this is, he used to talk about it in terms of a menu. That was innovative because it was before you have to take that class and that class and that class and then go to the second course and take that class, and that it was no more like that. You could choose your own, make your own curriculum, like if you were ordering food in a restaurant, right? And it was called the well-laid menu, in the words of Boyarsky. Well, now that's normal everywhere where we have studied, in the United States where we teach, etc. No, there hasn't been that much innovation. So I think the last time that there was really radical transformation, and as I say, it's all very different, is in this moment, which for some reason there is kind of an unbelievable eruption of experiments of very different quality and characteristics in different parts of the world.
Nikita, you have started a new school a couple of years ago, and I believe it was quite a challenge putting a new curricula together. And I was wondering, what was your idea behind the system you have now at Marsh? What kind of architect are you trying to educate?
Well, it is not an easy question. Frankly speaking, I'm a little bit in trouble now because you see that, well, in Russia, there was nothing similar to radical pedagogy, and I'm afraid that the experiments in Russian architecture education ended almost 80 years ago. That's why now I'm talking very much from outside of this situation. For me, well, maybe the most important question is that radical pedagogy is it the historical phenomenon? Well, was it ended, or vice versa? This is the normal element of architectural education. Well, because it seems to me that the radical pedagogy existed in a very special historical circumstances, and now we are still using the achievements of this epoch. Like you said before, the ideas of Boyarsky, the unit system, the free choice of topics, and for example, the idea of research, of incorporation of a research inside the architectural education. It's also the consequence of this let's say, revolution in architecture and architectural education. I'm not sure that March is so radical. We are thinking, first of all, about the purposes of the education, not about the form. I'm sure that well, the aim, the goal of education is to teach, well, and is to make, well, our students first smart, well, to think before drawing, well, then sensitive, well, to be sensitive to the, well, to see what is happening in reality, well, in all kind of realities, in physical reality of the world around us, and, well, let's say, political, economical, social realities, well, and to be responsible, to understand that what we do is a kind of, it influences very much, well, our surrounding people, and not only now, but in 10 years after our project. Well, but how to do that? Well, this is the most important question. Well, and and I think that we should be radical in putting questions, yeah, in putting problems, but not every time in solutions.
I really like this idea because the fact that education is supposed to give you instruments to learn to understand the world is what I really enjoy about learning personally. And I was wondering, Brendan, what you could say from the Strelka perspective, because the school basically reinvents itself every year and the curricula changes every year, and you cannot compare one year to another. So this is a very radical experiment in a way.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it is an experiment for sure, and I think that more than anything, Strelka itself is an experiment, and it almost uses each studio as a kind of laboratory to try out different things, and it's over the course of the years it exists, tried to refine its processes and tried to figure out what things work and what things don't, and over the course of that time, I think it's changed how much it emphasizes certain things and sort of backgrounds other things. So I think that's true. And I would say that what's interesting about it, particularly for me, is that it puts you in a position, if you're teaching here, that you're, at least in terms of some aspect of the studio, you know significantly less than the people that you're working with. So it really it makes for a very sort of ambiguous relationship in terms of distributing responsibility and sort of expertise. And I think that's an intentional thing, because ultimately a lot of the subjects that are being explored here are not things that you really can definitively know everything about from some expert, but you have to sort of piece together a lot of different hunches and sort of make it up as you go along. And really, in a lot of ways, what the people who are trying to lead these studios are doing is just trying to be a kind of useful guide, or a kind of someone who's been through that process in another way before, to kind of help orient people. And I think that's, in a way, radical. I don't think it's completely new or anything, but I do think that to the extent that it's being experimented with here, it's significant.
And this is interesting. You've raised the question of this relationship between a teacher and a student, because there's always a certain hierarchy, and it's interesting how people give away their responsibility to give more freedom to students. And I believe you all had a teaching experience, a very extensive one, and it would be great if you could share if you had any interesting, radical practices within the learning process.
You want me to say something about that? Yeah, I mean, I don't think you really... I mean, I think in many ways when Brenda was speaking, I realized that it's very similar to what I do, except that the difference, I suppose, is that I'm working with PhD students and you're working, or here at the Strelka, you're working with design students. But in many ways, for me, I think the studio was the model. I mean, I think pedagogically, the studio is still in architecture pedagogy. It's really a fantastic model that a lot of people from outside architecture are looking into it now at universities, you know. This kind of think tank phenomenon in which we tend to bring experts from other disciplines, and it's really becoming a model for other people. So, but with regard to this question of whether you advocate your responsibility when you put yourself more at the level of the students, you do not advocate responsibility, not at all. But you act more, as Brendan was saying, I mean, maybe the only more expertise that you have with when you are addressing an issue that you don't know anything, is that you already have done several research projects, so you know maybe how to go about things, but not the topic itself. So you can be a guide, oh yeah, why don't you go into, you know, there is an archive at MoMA. Well, if you see that there, maybe you want to look also under the table. I mean, you have kind of tips, tricks of research that you have developed over the years. In that sense, you can be more of a coach, but you are learning at the same time a huge amount, which I think is something that is not always recognized in education, that the teacher is learning as much as the students or more, right?
Yeah, actually, just to answer your question, which relates to that, is I had a teacher, I mean, I didn't study architecture, I studied journalism, and I had a teacher who was a kind of, like a novelist and had worked as a journalist for a long time and was basically like a very eccentric sort of alcoholic. And she really like drained all of the students in the class for their kind of the things about life that they sort of knew about and that they were deeply engaged in, and she would always try to arrange sort of like trips out of the class so that people could show her like where they grew up or what kind of thing they do at night or whatever. And it was really interesting. I understand now, I understand better why she did that, because she was just sort of like a vampire, draining us of interesting stories that she could then use for herself. But actually, for me, it was a really radical experience because it really showed that you need to get out of the classroom and engage with real life to be a good writer or to be a journalist. And in a way, I think that's equally important for an architecture school, because it's very easy to get hung up on, computers and AutoCAD and Google and all this stuff, and forget that actually it's a human concern and there's just fundamental human needs that you're trying to address as an architect. And for me, that one specific case was really interesting because we ended up doing so many weird, also really unpleasant things, just under the guise of like learning to write long-form journalism. And for me, that was an interesting experience, and one that I think actually, would be relevant in almost any educational context.
Can I ask you a question? Do you really think that she was, or he was, a woman?
A woman, yeah.
Do you think she was really trying to get your stories in order to write her own stories?
She ended up writing a story about one of the things that we did. Yeah, I mean, I don't mean to say it like it's not necessarily negative, really, but everyone is just. I mean, it's also good for there to be actively working people leading studios who are also. I mean, this is also happening in architecture schools that
all the time.
They're just pursuing their own interests through students,
Yes.
and then using it and showing it in lectures and using it to inform their own work. I mean, this is
in architecture is clearly, I mean, they put projects that are related to what they are about to build or something like this. But in your case, when you were talking about this teacher, I thought that what she was trying to teach was precisely this, that you can only be a writer, a good writer, when you connect to that part that you really know. I mean, the best writers are the ones that really write about what they actually do know and has affected them personally. And that is maybe what she was trying to get you guys to see, that you have to go back to that kind of crazy thing that you think is not important, but that is where it's at, right? No, I don't know. I thought it was a very good example.
For me, students and tutors are not the same. Sorry, because usually students are paying to teachers and not vice versa. Usually. But at the same time, I'm sure that now the education, in architecture as well. This is the collective work of the team, and this unit system is oriented to such a collective work. To build a team around the problem, which is in the center of the studio. In this sense, of course, we are working together on the problem, which is interesting for teachers, interesting for students, and somehow new for both of them. I believe that this idea of collective work is very important for architecture today, because now this is not an epoch of heroes, but of teams, and maybe the best decisions and the best projects are done in a teamwork, and not only in architects teams, but in multidisciplinary teams, including many other specialists, like engineers, like I don't know, journalists or artists or scientists. We should teach in the same way from the very beginning. To show that the project is not a product of solo, of one genius artist.
I guess the question of multidisciplinarity is very interesting here, because sometimes when you put different disciplines together that might seem totally unconnected, you might get very interesting results. And this is very interesting. I saw the sentence in the presentation you were showing, architecture in times of disciplinary instability. And I started to think, what could be the main threats and opportunities for architecture in this time? And it would be interesting to hear your perspective on how architecture changes in time when all disciplines are unstable and they merge together and form new phenomena.
I mean, this is part of this moment as well. The realization that architecture involves the same kind of reaction that we have now against the kind of the individual hero and the unique building they have in the 70s. I mean, the students were complaining at the AA or in Barcelona or in Paris about the idea of a history of architecture that is a history of heroes and masterpieces, and they wanted to know more about how things were were happening, right? So the idea to collaborate with sociologists or philosophers is part of this moment too. Until recently, because this generation just died. I mean, the sociologists, in-house sociologists at Princeton, died only 2 years ago. All the schools of architecture in the United States, from that moment on of the 70s, had to have a sociologist in the house, right? I mean, and ours was very good. Bob Gutman, who had also been part of the institute, etc., and he was a major figure. In the 90s, it was more philosophy, no, because of the Derrida and Deleuze and everything, and all the schools of architecture felt that they have to have philosophers in their team. But I think the structural problem, which is the problem that you just brought up, is very, very important. Because despite the fact that we all know that architecture is a very complex practice that involves all these people, including the clients, or even the politicians, or the construction I mean, everybody, right? Landscape designers, lighting specialists. We still have books on the history of architecture that only recognize the one name and one building, and this is very problematic. And it's very interesting that we are in a time now that this is unacceptable, actually. That the most creative work, as you say, is being produced, maybe always it was, being produced in these collaborative teams. You know, we had a Russian example in Venice, the group NER, which somehow, I don't know how, Giancarlo De Carlo knew about them and invited them to the Triennale in Milano, that Triennale Occupata, that Triennale they were there as one of the youngest groups. There were other groups like Archigram or the Smithsons and etc. And they were there. There are photographs of them. They look almost like kids of how young they are. So, despite the fact that education perhaps was not very innovative at the time, something was indeed happening in that moment. I also have seen pictures of them dancing in some square here with very cool suits. Have you seen those pictures? Really extraordinary how all this culture of music and also fashion was also developing here or arriving here, or kind of this was very, very interesting case. I think it was developed precisely by this Russian student in our program, Masha Pantaleyeva.
I know, Brendan, you also have lived in China for a while, and it would be interesting to hear how this multidisciplinary perspective is being accepted or not accepted there, and also here in Russia.
I think what's interesting about a place like China, and when I say a place like China, what I really mean is a place that's whose culture is changing very quickly and who's kind of modernizing and is really changing, is that in terms of multidisciplinary work, it actually happens in a very organic and natural way because they're all sort of part of the same scene. So like artists and architects and people making music, people doing choreography, it's really plausible that they would be friends and hanging out together. Not even necessarily that they're making work together, but it's obviously, it's a lot easier to start making work if you're already friends and you know each other and you respect each other. And for the filmmakers also. That I think is really interesting, and I think in Europe and the States where those boundaries are better established and sort of, you can very easily spend your entire life only talking to architects or whatever, it's less likely that that happens in a natural way. Sometimes it can be forced to happen because it's interesting to force it to happen. But yeah, in a place like China, and even like, and I actually, you know, I'm now like appearing like some sort of PR agent for Strelka, but what's interesting about Strelka too is it's a bit like that there's a weird aspect of it where a lot of different types of people just sort of end up together in a kind of really random way that I would imagine outside of the studio context where it's all very kind of concentrated and intentional, in an unintentional and much weirder way, it also happens here organically. And I think that's, and actually the Venice Biennale was a good example of that we were doing it, you know, I was a journalist, and then Dash was an architect, Anton was a philosopher, then we asked a theater director to come and collaborate with us and a graphic designer. And all of that was completely natural, and all of it was basically friendships that then worked together to become multidisciplinary. But the foundation of it was actually real, like, personal feelings. And I think that's a nice aspect of yeah, the way that multidisciplinarity works in places where the distinctions between disciplines aren't that well established, and it isn't like written into the culture yet. So that there's a lot more flexibility in terms of in terms of doing things together.
What I'm thinking now, it's maybe a little bit another direction, well, of this problem. Well, I'm trying to go a little bit deeper, well, to the core of this phenomena of radical pedagogy, and for me is a question if radical pedagogy is leading to radical architecture. Well, is this connection, is it so direct connection? Because, for example, on one of the last slides, I saw Aldo Rossi. Well, I think that, he was a radical teacher. Well, but I'm not, and his approach, was quite radical to architecture. I mean, the result maybe it is not the obligatory radical result, and vice versa. Well, if radical architecture is a result of radical pedagogy or not. Well, and maybe this connection with the practice, with the real architecture is more controversial than the direct step, yeah, from pedagogical experiments to architecture. And if we are looking onto the biographies or careers of people on the screen, like Rem or like Eisenman or like Venturi, well, all of them have very different ways. Well, and it's hardly possible to imagine that, for example, Venturi is building the CCTV building, well, in Beijing.
Yeah. Two things. One, I think it's very important that radical is borrowing from Germano Celan, but we use it in a different sense. So Germano Celan was really referring to Archigram, Superstudio, etc., to this group of radicals of Florence. We don't use it in this term, in this sense, even if those people are also part of our project. We use it in the literal meaning of radical coming from radix in Latin, from radice in Italian, which means going back to the roots. And it can be going back to the roots to destabilize the foundations of architecture, as some of these groups were doing. But it could also be like Cooper Union, Haydock, and Rossi, etc., going back to the roots of architecture, to what they understood was the formal language of architecture, to investigate this. So the idea of Rossi, of going back to these vernacular forms of his childhood, is also a form of radical architecture. So there is this paradox that you can have in the same group people that are saying, no, architecture is autonomous, it has nothing to do with society, it has nothing to do with anything, it has nothing to do with economy, it's autonomous, it has to develop this language, and we have to go back to this kind of the roots of this language. And this is happening simultaneously with people that are throwing away everything that we know as architecture, like the superstudio, archigrams, archisms, anything, metabolism, etc. So these phenomena coexist. As to whether radical pedagogy produces good radical architecture or even good architects, there is no evidence for any of the above, right? I mean, if you look at the history of modern architecture, I always tell that to the students because it freaks them out. The history of 20th century architecture is made of people that never went to school, right? Adolf Loos didn't finish school. Mies van der Rohe didn't go to school. Le Corbusier didn't go to school. Charles Sims was thrown out of school, and so on and so on. Until the mid-century, basically the best architects of our time, of the 20th century, did not go to school. Even Rem Koolhaas did not finish his degree at the AA. The AA, as he says, was a buzz in sex and rock and roll, and he went to the United States and he was given the degree afterwards, even if he actually didn't finish his diploma. So he doesn't have a degree, actually. He has some paper that he was given by the AA, right? But he didn't finish his studies. So I think if you look at all these schools that consider themselves the best in the world, I always joke with the students at Princeton. So you think that just because you came to Princeton, you will be a good architect. So can you name people that graduate from here? And actually, Princeton is pretty good. Same for the GSD. You can name only a few that survived that process. And in the meantime, you have people coming out of anywhere. So it's not necessarily the case that a good school produces a kind of genius architect, and maybe that's a good thing. I mean that this phenomenon is kind of beyond the schools, and what we can do in the school is something that is much more responsible, which is to educate the student in what it is, this field of architecture, to teach them to think, because of course we are always working in a rapidly evolving world. So what you are teaching in school maybe is not the case when you graduate, but you have to have the tools to think the situation, right? So that's, I think, what education in the end is useful for.
But this is interesting, though. The school is still a big deal. The name of the school is still a big deal for students. A lot of them go to certain universities just because they look at the rankings and they see, okay, maybe I should go to Columbia, or maybe I should go to AA. And it's the education itself in this case becomes a certain market, and the way you market yourself is a very big deal as well. And maybe to conclude the discussion and to wrap up, I would like to raise a very interesting question of architecture and media, and especially of architectural education and media, since we have been talking about architectural pedagogies and things that have been very radical at a certain time. All of these things were largely communicated through magazines, through exhibitions, and it's very nice that you do the same thing with your project. So was this a particular strategy you have chosen to talk about the research, or it's just a natural way you wanted to exhibit the results of your work?
I thought when I was doing these collaborative projects that are very unusual in the field of PhDs, as I say, in which normally people tend to work in isolation, was actually the idea that it was not only a question of reflecting on architecture and media, but experimenting in new forms of media, whether it was an exhibition, a book, a film, a platform, and on and on. So more contemporary forms of communication. So I'm interested in architecture and communication in both sense, as a subject matter, but also to experiment with it. And I wanted the students to experiment with all these forms of media. That way, actually, that part of their, many of these PhDs went to architecture school. So architecture is like their first love, if you want. And so returning to do projects, whether it's an exhibition, you see them engaged in very interesting ways, because they feel like they were abandoned this in favor of research for a little while, but then you saw them that you can do both, and that is very interesting. And actually moving from doing things to think about things is also, and exhibitions, I love particularly exhibitions, because they have something that nobody in the world of PhDs and in the world of research has, which is a very hard deadline. You can make a fool, I keep repeating the entire semester, you can make yours fool of yourself in the Venice Biennale, or you can do well. I mean, because of course there was all this procrastination and all these nightmares and all these fights between them, and somebody say, okay, you can choose. You can choose to not make it. You can choose to make a fool of yourself, or you can choose to do it. But it's a very hard deadline. There is nothing you can do. It's not like a book. It's not ready yet, maybe 1 year later. But no, an exhibition is there and now. And you have to be, and I like that. It's very much like the way architects operate with hard deadlines.
It's really interesting. There are various ways to display your work, and the way you do it, it's always up to you. I guess if students would, even with a PhD thesis, if you could make it into a magazine or you could make it into a movie, that would be a very fantastic experience for each student, I guess. Maybe we should have a round of questions from the audience.
Thank you. I have a question for Beatriz Colomina. The map that you showed at the very beginning, I noticed had spots to the east of the Berlin Wall. And my question would be, what did happen, or what experiments in education, architectural education, were in fact taking place? And in addition to that, I would also ask, what were particular specific ways that the Cold War impacted, or the impacts of the Cold War has had on architectural practice and education to the other side of the wall? Thank you.
Very little we know, except this example that, as I say, of the group NER in Moscow, that was part of the. We know very, very little about architectural pedagogy in East Europe. Very, very little. Very little experiments. But of course, this is a work in progress. It always happens that somebody will come and say, there was this thing that was done here and there. And this has also happened with little magazines, right? When we did the project of the little magazines, also we knew very little about Eastern Europe. But then somebody came with a bootleg copy of L'Architecture d'aujourd'hui that was being produced here in Moscow, and other things were, some guy came with some Polish magazine. So we realized things were going to be unearthed as the project goes on. But we don't know, in the exhibition there was no particular cases. I think, as you say, mostly the education was very institutional and very top down. So I'm not expecting big discoveries, but we don't know really.
The second part was about Cold War.
Oh yes,
How
yes.
Cold War influenced the the pedagogy on both sides of Berlin Wall.
Yeah. Yes, that's very, very significant. I think, particularly if you think about Berlin and the Freie University, etc. But the most significant thing, I suppose, was also the space program. This was of enormous fascination in the schools of architecture all over the world. It kind of inspired all this new thinking about what is the existence minimum. No? So the capsule of the spaceship and the whole fascination with this inspired a lot of architecture in the West, definitely. I don't know if it was the same here, but also in Japan, no, the capsule, etc. In terms of politics, of course, many of the revolutions of that period were looking at the East. I mean, and if you think about some of the professors that were here in the screen, from Aldo Rossi to Manfredo Tafuri to the professors that I had in Barcelona, they were all communists. We were all communists, right? There was not another way to be. If you were in Spain in the time of Franco, you could be in a dictatorship, face this dictatorship, or you can think that the world should be different, right? And so this is also affecting very much the struggles in a lot of the world. If you consider that Spain didn't finish with the dictatorship until 1976. I'm basically a product of those years.
Thank you a lot for the great talk. It was a big pleasure, and thank you for staying with us.